So you're in for a treat, again, getting to hear directly about the research from Camille, the site from Orrin, and then we also are honored to be able to welcome two educators who have partnered with us for a number of years on the development of Cultivate, and who in their school are actually kind of living this out, and so they'll get to share their experience also. So it's now my pleasure and great honor to introduce Mr. Daniel O'Shaughnessy, the president of the IA O'Shaughnessy Foundation. Mr. O'Shaughnessy served as on the foundation's board of directors for 10 years prior to assuming the role of president of the foundation. In his work and in his role, he shares his grandfather, IA O'Shaughnessy's vision of supporting education programs that grow and enhance the ability of our children to reach their greatest potential. Thank you so much for being here, Mr. O'Shaughnessy, and thank you again for the foundation's support of this work.
Thank you, Elliot. It's a pleasure to be here. And good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Dan O'Shaughnessy, and it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome you here today on behalf of the IA O'Shaughnessy Foundation and UChicago Impact. We are so happy to have this wonderful group of distinguished leaders, education professionals, and supporters here today in order to learn more about cultivating learning environments that promote positive student outcomes. Thank you all for coming to the Chicago Literacy Alliance for this event. Thank you for coming, that each of you found time in your very busy schedule. This might help. That each of you found time in your very busy schedules to learn more about this approach. Serves as a reminder to us all just how important this work is. We are so glad you are here. We are very excited about UChicago's new tool called Cultivate. Our family's foundation has been pleased to support UChicago's work over the past 4 years. In developing this research-based survey, which they will tell you about and demonstrate today. Our foundation, begun by my grandfather, IA O'Shaughnessy, has always been a supporter of educational improvements, and we know that excellent educational success today, as they were We've always been a supporter of educational improvements, and we know that excellent educational institutions and practices are as critical to our country's well-being and success today as they were over 75 years ago when this foundation was started. So it has been exciting for us to support UChicago's Impact as they have taken groundbreaking research and through their unique practice-based process developed a fabulous lever that teachers and schools use to foster environments where students are most effectively supported in their learnings. I'm especially pleased that we will be hearing today from our featured speaker, the lead researcher in the formation of the Cultivate tool, Dr. Camille Farrington. Where are you? There you are. She is a national expert on the role of non-cognitive factors that impact academic performance and in-classroom approaches that have been proven to help students learn more effectively. Her research and publications may be known to many of you here. But I'd like to share a quick personal story that illustrated to me some of the influence and impact Dr. Farrington has had on the people who are in the education field every day. Earlier this fall, while on a foundation site visit to an innovative elementary school in Denver, a young and passionate lead teacher was explaining to us about the power of classroom culture on the learning outcomes of students and how teaching practices can create environments that really help even the most challenged learners succeed. She told us about her personal and professional hero in the field and how this person's work was so inspirational and helpful to her. She explained that she had felt fortunate to meet her personally at a recent conference in Chicago where she was able to have in-depth conversations with her from which she learned so much. We were all quite delighted, but not terribly surprised, to hear that the inspirational educator she was talking about was none other than Dr. Farrington herself. A wonderful coincidence. I am eager for you all to hear from Dr. Farrington today. Would also like to give special thanks to the team from UChicago Impact, led by Elliot Ransom and Dr. Orrin Murray, who have performed their hardworking magic and transformed the lessons from deep academic research into an accessible tool for improving education. Thank you also to today's panelists who will talk to you about the use of the Cultivate tool. And thank you again for coming today. We appreciate your time and commitment to this work. I'll now turn the mic over to Dr. Farrington, who will brief us on her latest research.
Hello, hello. Okay, I promise, just because I had this clicker, I had nothing to do with all of that back there. So I want to just take a few minutes to give you some background on the survey work itself, the research around that, and then its transition into the tool that we'll be talking about today. So I always love to start any talk about students with this slide. So what do students think about in school? And I was a high school teacher for 15 years, and so I spent 15 years trying to cajole students into thinking about these two things, about content knowledge and academic skills. I thought that is my job. But I've come to really realize that what students think about in school is all kinds of other things, that they're, particularly adolescents, because I was teaching high school, are really overtaken with psychosocial preoccupations, questions about developing identity, because that's really their job when they're adolescents. Who am I? Where do I belong? What am I capable of? Are the questions that they come into high school with. And then when we pile on all kinds of work, that adds on all kinds of other questions. Can I be successful at this? How do I even feel about this stuff? And even if I wanted to do it, do I know how? And if we aren't addressing those psychosocial preoccupations, we can never get to the content knowledge and academic skills. So in 2012, colleagues at the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research, so Elaine, who is here, Nicole, who is here, several of us worked together to really try and understand what does the literature say about supporting students' performance in school. We knew that grades mattered, we knew that on track mattered, and so well, what do we know about the things that contribute to grades and performance? And from that, we put together, from that research review, we put together this model, kind of a hypothetical model based on how the pieces all seem to fit together. And that academic performance was really driven by students' behaviors and perseverance, but it turns out that behaviors and perseverance are driven by academic mindsets, learning strategies, and all of that is supported by the classroom conditions in the classroom environment. We also looked at social skills. There's some evidence in early elementary school that there's some relationship with academic performance. That's less. There's less evidence of that in high school, and it turns out there's just not that direct of a relationship between social skills specifically and academic behavior. But mindsets, there's evidence over many, many years, and particularly what we're talking about here is mindsets of I belong in this community, I feel like I can succeed at this, my ability and effort, my ability and competence grow with my effort, so a growth mindset, and this work has value for me. If students believe these things, or believe even any one of these things, it really propels them to work harder, to overcome difficulties and challenges and setbacks, to apply the academic behaviors that are going to help them really do well in school, and then to earn higher grades. And we really see mindsets as kind of perceptual filters through which they're interpreting everything that happens. And it turns out that what matters more than anything is not some objective reality of what's happening, but what a young person perceives is happening and how they believe, what they believe about that. in terms of their own behavior in an environment. So from this, then the next step after we had done this review was, well, let's test this model and let's also see how well we can measure these things. So then we began a survey development project where we dropped social skills and we focused on mindsets, learning strategies, perseverance, and behaviors. And then we got grades in the studies, we got grades from at the end of the semester after students had taken the surveys. And I want to walk you through how this survey was designed because it's particularly unique design that allowed us to really tease apart the impact of classrooms. And so over the course, I should back up and just say that we, over a few years from 2012 to 2015, we tested out, we piloted several different survey measures with actually about 10,000 students all around the country, including in Chicago, but more expansively. And once we thought we had a pretty good survey, then we wanted to say, the next question for me is like, okay, well, you can have a survey and you can give people data, but what are they going to do with it? And we really wanted to understand how schools, teachers, principals would use the data to do anything. And so over the course of the 2015-2016 school year, we worked closely with multiple partners. So 3 school districts in Madison, Minneapolis, and Springfield, Ohio, 2 charter networks here in Chicago, and then 6 individual schools, 5 of which are expeditionary learning or EL education schools, which focus specifically around character development and mindsets. And so we wanted to say, well, okay, those should be interesting places to study. And 2 of our guests today are from the GEMS Ohio School. And so learning how teachers understood the data helped inform then how we built the survey platform for Cultivate to really tell a story with the data that would help them kind of see what the next steps are. So let me say something about the survey design because it really is a unique design and it allowed us to do something kind of cool from a research perspective. So we got all the students their course schedules in advance. And so when this young lady plugs into the survey and signs in, we already knew that these were her 4 core courses around math, science, English, and social studies. And so we had pre-selected 2 of the classes to ask her about. And so it starts off and it says, we know you're in English 2, and we want to ask you some questions about English 2. And it asks 2 sets of questions. First of all, it asks a set of questions about the conditions in the classroom, mostly things teachers are doing and things the young person is experiencing inside that classroom. And then asks a bunch of questions about her own reports of her mindsets, her use of learning strategies, her perseverance, and her behaviors in the class, her participatory behaviors in the class. And then at the end of the term, we would get her grade for Algebra 2. But then in addition to her, we also asked multiple of her classmates to tell us about Algebra 2. So we could have kind of an aggregate measure of what does Algebra 2 look like as a classroom. And then we look to see to what extent does this classroom then predict what she says here, okay? And we also asked her about a second class. We go, we know you're also in English 10. Tell us all about English 10. Likewise, she could tell us all about both that classroom and herself in English 10. And then we could compare. If those classrooms are different from each other, according to what all the students in those classrooms are saying, does that line up with differences in her own self-reported mindsets, strategies, perseverance, behavior, and do we see differences in her grades? So that's what I will share with you today. First, just to give you a sense of some of the questions. So the classroom conditions, these are a sample of the questions. Notice that we are always focusing her back on this class and this teacher. So it says at the stem says in Algebra 2, how true is this? And the teacher makes what we're learning really interesting. The teacher knows my strengths and weaknesses in this class. This teacher notices if I have trouble learning something. And then we would ask questions about, okay, now tell us about yourself in Algebra 2. And you can see again, doing well in this class is an important part of who I am. If I'm not naturally smart in this subject, I will never do well in it. I feel like my classmates in this class accept me for who I am. And there was a whole bag of questions around these two things. And so what we found was, first of all, that students' mindsets, learning strategies, perseverance, and behaviors, what they said about their own mindsets and behaviors in the class, predicted their grades for that class. And if they said different things across the two classrooms about themselves, that predicted differences in their grades across the two classrooms. And we've seen this over and over again with different samples. Like every place we looked, we saw this same pattern. And let me give you an example. So we know that this related to academic performance, so just let me give you an example of what that looks like. So here you just see high or low on self-reported time management. And these are how many students out of the full sample got A's, and in high versus low. And then likewise you see how many students got F's versus F's versus in a low versus high. So again, we saw this pattern here's with growth mindset versus fixed mindset. So you see over and over again that the same pattern, and we'll have questions in just a second.
Is this for students or classrooms?
For students, individual students, yeah. And so the same student could actually be in both of these places if they reported a growth mindset in one classroom and a fixed mindset in another classroom, okay? And so we see this pattern over and over again, that you're more likely to get A's, less likely to get F's if you have high versus low. And then we also saw that classroom conditions really predicted what students said about mindsets, strategies, behaviors. And so really overall, what the implications for this is like that how students experience their classrooms really influences their engagement and academic performance, and that teachers don't know how students are experiencing their classrooms. Teachers only know what they're intending to do, but they don't know how that's landing with students. And we actually saw quite a bit of variation within a classroom of how students were perceiving what was happening. And so teachers need ways to hear from students about their classroom experiences and how they're seeing things in different classrooms. And lastly, that cultivating that rather than trying to say, I'm going to try and give this student a growth mindset, if you say, I'm going to try to create the conditions in the classroom that will cultivate young people to develop in a really healthy, positive way, that's the strongest lever that teachers have for impacting the students' growth and development. Okay, that was a quick overview. We have about 5 minutes for if there's questions around that, because that was a lot of stuff. Yes.
So I'm curious about how you normalize or adjust for variance in subjectivity grading by the teachers. So, right, there are a lot of different ranges. I'm not a data wonk, so
yeah, so teachers have very different grading practices, and we didn't control for that. What we did control for is like how many, we control for the achievement level of other people in the classroom and the demographics of other people in the classroom in one class versus another. So for example, if a class had all super high achieving students or not, like we controlled for those things. But it was such a big sample and there were so many classrooms that we figured that like the hard graders and the easy graders kind of get washed out in the overall analysis. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about, we got to the end of the last slide, right? And we've kind of got this like sequence of events that kind of start with the kids and their perceptions of what's happening in their classrooms and their feelings about it, and the habits that they have as a result of that. So then there's this kind of a really cool claim that better to be a gardener than a carpenter, right? Cultivate instead of build. So what then, what's the next step for teachers? Like how do you get from one to the other, or how do we, and I help manage schools,
Yeah.
cultivate
Yeah.
that type of thinking with teachers?
Yeah, when we wrote the survey items around the classroom conditions, one of the things that we really used as a kind of litmus test as to whether the survey item would get in or out is whether it was immediately actionable by teachers, if they could see exactly. So for example, my teacher knows my strengths and weaknesses, that it couldn't just be some like, oh, great, well, how am I supposed to make that happen? It had to be something where it was immediately actionable and obvious, like what the teacher could do to improve that thing. Exactly for the reason you were thinking about. Yes.
As a school leader, how would you, what advice would you give on, like, how would someone use their 5 essentials data and complement it with these data, and how does sort of the whole
That's a great
thing come
question.
together?
Yeah, so the 5 essentials data is giving you data about school organization broadly, and this is giving you more specific information about classrooms and what's happening inside classrooms. And as you'll see in the demo, that you can break that down by subject area or grade level or both of those. Yes.
I'm just curious if in any of the surveys or any of the analysis, was there ever a comparison between the teacher's perception of what they were doing versus the student's perception?
That's such a great question. Okay, so do you want to guess what the answer to that is? So we asked the exact same questions of the teacher about their own practice, and the teachers and the students' responses were correlated at 0.1. In other words, almost not at all. Okay, so yeah, there's almost no relationship between what teachers said they did and what students said they did. And so I think that emphasizes the point that your own perceptions of what you're trying to do as a teacher can be far afield from what students are actually experiencing and what's actually in play within a classroom. Yes.
Cadence of the survey, so teachers can adjust their strategies and how to.
So this is we see this as kind of diagnostic of a classroom. Like, so it's in the October usually, and then in the spring. We're actually doing work with PERT's organization out of Stanford to align it with a more frequent, so teachers can get feedback directly.
How long is the survey for students?
20 minutes? 12. Oh, I thought you said, I was like, 20? That seemed loud. Yeah. They only, so now, okay, so I should clarify one thing. So in the research, we asked them to respond on 2 different classrooms, and then we waited and got their grades, and like all of that takes forever. And so once we found these same patterns over and over in every sample of students we worked with, now what we do is we just ask each student about one classroom. We're not comparing them to themselves. We're just getting feedback about different classrooms from the students to provide back to the teachers. Yep. And yeah, then we don't wait for their grades so that we could deliver the survey results much more
Did you
quickly.
encounter teacher defensiveness?
That's a really good question. I'll let our principal and teacher speak to how they have done it. But that was definitely something people thought about. We don't name teachers in this. It's never down to the Mrs. Johnson's class. This happened. It's disaggregated either by grade level or by subject area, and if you only have one 6th grade science teacher, then you know who that teacher is. But if you're in a bigger school, then you actually don't know which classroom that is, but our thought was grade level teams are doing the work. And so a 9th grade team could look at their data together, or a science team could look at their data together. But we were trying to walk the fine line of, teacher evaluation concerns and all of that.
Was there any difference between middle schools and high schools, or could you talk a little bit about that? You just mentioned 6th grade, and I was going to ask a question about, but just in general in the sample, how did that look?
Right, so 6th through 12th grade, the patterns are the same. The some of the items, the relationships, like 6th grade specifically, I think there is a little weaker relationships on some things. And it gets stronger as and part of that could just be literacy levels. So, and I think we're probably out of time. Okay, well, thank you so much. And now I want to turn this over to Orrin, who is the Director of Technology and R&D at UChicago Impact. And so Orrin led the team so once we had done all this survey work, we then started working with UChicago Impact to create a survey that wasn't us. Like the first time I came to visit these guys, I was like bringing PDF printouts to hand to them, and Orrin really helped to move that beyond PDF printouts if you wanted your data back.
Great, thanks, Camille. Okay, so I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so giving you a walkthrough of the reporting site. And a couple of things I'm going to do to sort of set the stage for this is to sort of build on a lot of what Camille said. So this is not your standard survey reporting site. And it's not because the information that we're trying to convey isn't the kind of information that you can look at numbers and try and figure out what's going on. It's the kind of information that you need to figure out what's going on in an environment, in a classroom. So we begin with essentially a scrolling website where we set up a set of questions. What are the stakes? What shapes academic performance? And how can you cultivate change? And then, we bring people through this process by focusing you on the classroom conditions that have the largest influence on students' mindsets and strategies, which then shape academic performance. So throughout this site, you're going to see a lot of reinforcement of the message, because we think that the message is really important for people to begin to engage with. Okay. And while we would love to have Camille give this research talk that she just did to everyone, we can't. So one of the first things we do is we orient people in the basic research, right? So that there's no question that what you're seeing here is based on solid research. And so you see essentially the basis of the research that the team did here, which is essentially to say that kids who have stronger mindsets get more A's and fewer F's than kids who have weaker mindsets or strategies who get less A's and fewer F's. So this again is a sort of foundational orientation framework so that teachers and principals who are looking at this reporting site can know that they're basing it on some really strong, rigorous research. As you scroll down here, on the left side, we're beginning again to have this narrative so that people really understand what they're going to be seeing. And here you see the academic mindsets, of which there are 6, the learning strategies, of which there are 2, and motivation, of which there's 1 measure. So I'm going to go a little bit into academic mindsets here for a second. And let's take a look at belonging. So there are some numbers here, and these numbers here are designed to try and orient people in terms of the relative strength of these particular mindsets to one another. And in large part, that's it. You can delve into these here and understand what questions that Camille pointed out make up this particular measure. So belonging, a belief that one fits in with peers in their class. And then if you really want to see the underlying data, you can click on one of these and see the percentage of kids that answered completely true or not completely true about a particular item level here, right? So, but to some extent, that's getting in the weeds, right? And some people want to get in the weeds, and we provide that to help them get in the weeds. But the important thing is that there's a different score here of 39, which on a scale of 100 is kind of low, right? And so, this is a mindset that probably needs to be looked at. As Camille pointed out, we provide you with an opportunity to look at these mindsets and learning strategies and the like by subject area. So if you have a subject team, you can see, in this case, social studies is doing a better job at belonging than English is doing at belonging in those classrooms that students are reporting on. You can look at it by grade level as well. And then you can look at grade level and subject area at the same time in this space. And so one of the things that we're trying to do with this part of the reporting site is to essentially have this notion of a sort of face validity, right? As a principal or as teachers, as you're looking through this, you should be like, oh yeah, those are our kids because these are those kids. Are these results, do these things line up with what you're seeing with kids in your classes? And so really this is designed to provide this notion of face validity for the kind of results that they're seeing. We really are not that interested in having people spend a whole lot of time digging into this, right? Because this is starting to try and figure out, like, what do I do with individual kids? When really what you should be spending more time focusing on is the connections. And so we scroll down a little bit further here and introduce classroom conditions. And this is the place where we begin to build a case that classroom conditions have an impact on certain mindsets and strategies. So let's take a look at developmental relationships here for a second. And in this view of the school's data, and it's important to point out that this is the data for a particular school, you can see that the percentage of students who report strong mindsets, and only these mindsets, belonging, self-efficacy, academic identity, motivation, are, in this instance, 79% of them are saying that they have high developmental relationships with their teachers, whereas 35% of the kids who report strong belonging have high developmental relationships with their teachers. So this particular slice at results is designed to reinforce this notion of the connection between these classroom conditions and the academic mindsets and learning strategies that we just showed. So we're essentially building a case. We're building an argument for people to focus on what? Classroom conditions. So I pointed out earlier that this is a pretty unique design in terms of providing survey results to folks. Impact also does the 5 essentials. We have STEP, and we have a lot of experience with dealing with large amounts of data and providing those data to people to help them try and figure out what to do. In this case, we're actually taking a pretty pointed effort to direct people what to do with the results that they have. So the 5 essentials, you can look at anything, any measure, and figure out what's going on. Here, we have a statement at the top of this that says, given your lowest mindsets and strategies for this particular school, for all of the students at this time, here are the things that you should focus on. And again, we give you the option to disaggregate by subject area, and you'll note that the things that they should focus on change from math to social studies, or for all students, right? And we have this prioritized list of these classroom conditions. So focus on teacher support for all of your students, or focus on a different one if you slice it slightly differently. I'm going to quickly delve again into developmental relationships, and we'll go down into the details here. So this becomes the place where we expect teams of teachers, whether they're grade level or subject area, to begin to focus on the things that are right here, right? So as you're thinking about these results as a team, the thing that you should probably be asking yourself is, given that the students in our school responded this way in this particular space, what are the things that we can do as teams of teachers to ask kids about their life outside of school and move more of the not at all true into the completely true, which will boost this particular score on developmental relationships. So I'm coming to the end of my time here, and you know, there's a lot that went into the development of this particular site, including working with educators in the field and Camille's team and the like. And obviously 10 minutes isn't a whole lot of time to shoehorn all of that. But I'm hoping that one of the things that you guys take away from this is the care that we've put into putting actionable results based on student data in the hands of educators so that they actually do something and they know what to do and how to take that action. So thanks a lot. I'll join you guys in just a little bit.
Our panelists this morning include Dr. Orrin Murray, who again is Director of Technology and R&D at UChicago Impact. We have Mr. James Kutnow, who is Dean and Director of Graham Elementary and Middle School in Columbus, Ohio, and his colleague, Ms. Cassie Muller, who is a math teacher, instructional coach, and resident educator coordinator at Graham Elementary and Middle School. Both Mr. Kutnow and Mrs. Muller have played an instrumental role in the development of the Cultivate survey and reporting site. They worked with Dr. Murray and team at UChicago Impact in the development and refinement of the reporting site, and with Dr. Farrington and team at the UChicago Consortium as they developed the survey. And finally, it is my pleasure and honor to introduce our moderator, award-winning journalist Cassie Walker-Burke. As many of you know, Cassie is the founding Chicago bureau chief of Chalkbeat, a nonprofit news site dedicated to covering public education in America. Before joining Chalkbeat, Cassie was assistant managing editor at Crain's Chicago Business and also was part of Crain's editorial board. She was also executive editor of Chicago Magazine, and her work has appeared in local and national outlets ranging from the Chicago Tribune to Politico to O, the Oprah magazine. So thank you all again for being here this morning, and Cassie, I will let you take things from here.
Thanks, Dana. Thanks for having me today. And what a great panel. I'm super excited to have this conversation. So, Orrin, why don't we start with you? You know, can you walk us through the conversation that you had when you called James, or you know, when you reached out to James? What is the pitch? What is the pitch here to school leaders, and what kinds of questions were you getting? Can you kind of walk us through that?
Well, I mean, I think the pitch is pretty simple, which is to say, like, how can we help you improve what's going on in your school? And so, you know, a lot of this was done by Camille and her team on the front end, and we came in and said, you know, we have these tools where we can provide you with all of this data, but let's try and figure out a way to make this data more actionable, and you have to spend less time sort of digging in and trying to make sense of it. So that's essentially the pitch.
And James, for you, a school administrator has a bajillion things on the list. Kind of where did this land, and what was your thinking? What did you have hesitations? What problems were you trying to solve?
I guess I'll start by saying we are a partner with EL Education, which Camille referred to, and part of that partnership is their intentionality around what they have three focuses for schools. They have the traditional academic, you know, achievement, you know, mastery of knowledge and skills is what they call it. We have culture and character is another one, and the third part is high quality student work. And so as part of our work with EL, we actually were introduced to Camille's original research. And so when I got a call and an invitation to be a part of the study, we started to put those dots together and said, we're all in it. I mean, like, this is work that aligns with some of the focuses that we have. We're excited about what we can learn based on some of the goals we had already started to think through setting on these around cognitive factors of achievement.
Can you talk a little bit about what did you see at the time were the strengths of your school, and what did you see the places that you felt like you needed to work on that this kind of resonated for you?
Yeah, I mean, Camille's first visit to us, she had us look at that flowchart and try to think through what does that look like at GEM. So academic behaviors, academic mindsets, strategies in the classroom. And so we took a look as a leadership team and used little post-it notes and wrote every little detail and ritual and tradition and effort we do in the school. So after school programs, student-led conferences, how we use learning targets, habit targets, the discipline processes. And so we would chart each of those on that flow chart. And in the end, she said, well, how do you know that you've been successful with your students? You know, and for us, it was not that everybody's getting A's. That's great. We want to see academic achievement, but we want to see our 8th graders, when they do what we call our passage presentations, kind of like a master's defense of I'm ready for high school, that they're able to get up front in front of a panel, take this seriously, and show that they actually have done X, Y, and Z. They have grown, they've shown academic successes, that they have learned from the behavior processes that maybe they've been a part of. So all those things together, when we can see every 8th grader get up and do that successfully and bring pride to themselves and their families, then yeah, we know that this is successful. So then in thinking that through with Camille, it's like, okay, now we can actually put this tool out there and get student perceptions of what are we actually trying to do? Is it making a difference? Or maybe it's not, and we need to tweak that a little bit. So being able to dig deeper was huge.
And for you, how did you present this to your staff? Because I imagine that's something you have to really think carefully about to get buy-in.
To some degree, it's kind of like, this is what we're doing, right? It was non-invasive in terms of getting students to get on the computer and do the survey. That's not a hard component, 15 minutes or whatever. So that was fine. And then when the data came back, at first it was more just leadership teams looking at this, but then we're kind of introducing more data to the staff. And I'll have to say that we have a great school staff that we constantly talk about growth mindset. And we're a small school, so when 8th grade science results aren't looking too good, you kind of know who that is. And that was a reality. But just having an honest conversation, like, again, this is student perceptions, this is real data. How can we grow? How can we school-wide make changes? I mean, teachers, educators, we do walkthroughs all the time, right? And walkthroughs there's a component of walkthroughs that this is school-wide data, right? So percentage of our classrooms are doing this and percentage are not. And we want to be doing those things. So let's think about how we can be doing those better. And some of the teachers are knocking it out of the park, and some of them need a little bit more support. So just having honest conversations about that for whole school improvement.
And what did the data tell you about your particular school? Like, where were you really strong? And where were you hitting it out of the park? And where did you feel like, ooh?
Yeah, not surprisingly, since day one, we've always talked about creating learning targets and using learning targets with our students in every class, in every grade. So that component of the feedback was strong. We're doing this and we're practicing it, and that's great. I think some of the first eye-opening components to us were student beliefs in their ability to succeed. So the idea that I'm not good at math, I'll never be good at math. That was oh wow, okay. We need to think about how we're communicating the ability and achievement possibilities for all students. And it's not just that you're not good at math. No, we can grow on this, we can learn on this, we can work with you. So those were the first two things that stuck out to us.
Yeah. Cassie, can you talk a little bit about teacher buy-in?
Yeah, as James mentioned, we have an amazing staff at our school, and so I remember I was a second-year teacher, I think, when we started working with you, so I was not quite at a leadership team level at that time, I guess, and I remember James coming back and saying that we were going to do some research work with Camille Farrington, and our staff was really excited about it. We had the opportunity to hear her speak in Detroit at the EL Education National Conference, and we were so excited that she was on stage sharing this work that she was doing with our school, and so teachers were believing in what she was sharing and really excited about the opportunity.
And so among teachers, what was the conversation like? So we have this survey and we're gonna see these things that reveal our strengths, but also that could be critical of some of the work we're doing. Can you talk a little bit about those conversations? Give us a little insight into that, and then maybe how they shifted over time.
Yeah. I think it depends on which teacher you're talking to a lot of the times. For most of our staff, it was an exciting opportunity to see what our students thought. And at first, the data was a little bit shocking. And like Camille mentioned, the teacher alignment with the student information does not always match up. And what we think is happening in our classrooms is not what students perceive as happening in our classrooms. And so most teachers were excited to know where we could grow from there and move forward with that to make our school a better place. And as we started collecting more data, I feel like the buy-in just kept getting more and more because there's so much research out there just about, and especially with what Camille's doing with about the classroom conditions and what impact that can have on our students.
A question for you, or James, either one. Can you give a specific example or two of a moment or a conversation or where a teacher changed his or her practice based on what they saw in the survey tool, or did something differently in the classroom based on what they had learned? Either one. Jump on.
Well, I am a math teacher, and so when I learned that our students had this perception of themselves that they were not good at math and they would never be good at math, I was like, oh no, I really need to do something about that. And so my shift as a teacher became more about the process of solving problems rather than getting to a final solution. And so oftentimes we just we go through the process of what we would do to solve a problem rather than celebrating that somebody got the question right. We celebrate the different strategies that people used. And that's become a really big part of my class. Like, we name strategies for solving after students that presented that strategy. And so students that may not typically feel successful in a math classroom because maybe they're not getting their answers correct, they have this strategy named after them that is like, yeah, I did that. And so everyone calls it that. We have the Dabaroni, which another student named. They just come up with these crazy names, but it's fun and the kids get that buy-in and really feel like they belong. So yeah, like dabbing. They love that one.
Dabbing. James, I don't know if there's anything you would add, anything that you saw that changed in the building or a specific instructional approach that changed.
I mean, I think one of the data points from the last year or so was the sense of belonging and reinforcing with teachers, like, are we greeting students as they come in the classroom? Are we engaging them in a sense before the classroom work really begins? And how are we debriefing our learning targets and our habit targets? So being strategic as a staff with our goals for the year to really hone in on some of those specific practices so that when we do walkthroughs, that's a point that we're going to look for, that we can impact the environment from the very beginning of each class period, and what difference does that make in the students' sense of belonging in that classroom. Yeah.
So I have to ask this question, Dana, I'm going off script. But we're in day 7 of a teacher strike here in Chicago, and I think that a lot of the conversations I've heard on picket lines are really about how teachers feel about the value of their profession. And so how can a tool like this be something that uplifts teachers and also school cultures among not just the children and the adults in the building, and not something that becomes another feeling demoralizing them? I had to ask.
I would say, we're from Columbus, Ohio. We're not on strike right now. They're functioning without us, which is great. Camille, when she sat down with us, one of the first things she said after we went through that exercise was, I don't know what your data is going to say before we even did the survey, because it's proven to work. So in some regards, you can tell staff, like, this is just another piece of information that is important to reflect on. And so being able to use the tool that Orrin and the team have created is extremely helpful to kind of navigate different classrooms and grade levels. And yeah, I guess you could look at a negative side of, like, well, this will speak poorly of a specific person's practice. And that's not the conversation at all. It really is, if we can focus on the students and the ability for students to grow, how can we take this data and not target a specific person or a specific classroom, but turn this into a school-wide culture initiative in a sense? Is that?
It does, but I'm going to push you a little bit because that's what I do. But if you're in a school where you only have one science teacher and you know pretty much what that data is saying and who that person is in the building, like how do you navigate that? Oh, please.
It was you, right?
Well, so as we have instructional coaches at our school, and so like James shared, we did not just share all of the information right away. And so as a leadership team, as instructional coaches, we were able to target specific teachers, specific classrooms, and what we could do to help them, to help their students feel supported and like the classroom conditions were being met. And so I can, as an instructional coach, use some of this data to go into a classroom and kind of in my mind have an idea of what we need to focus on, and then also work on getting that teacher buy-in, but it's not this glaring like, oh, you're really not doing a good job at this. It's building their buy-in to it and their belief that they can make a change.
I think looking at the tool is non-evaluative. I mean, this is student perceptions, which is real, right? When we have those conversations about discipline or whatever, like that reality to them is reality, whether it's real to me or not. But how do you help a student process what's going on in their head? And so as a teacher, how do I say this? As an administrator, you kind of know where your weaknesses are in the building, right? And how do you support that teacher? Well, you can say, hey, this is some data that we've collected. It looks like in your class students are feeling this way. What do you think? And having a conversation with individual staff members, if it gets to that point where it's individually recognizable, you know, what students are saying, let's reflect on this data and what can we do to improve our practices. It's not like, well, okay, now we have an evaluation of your annual, you know, whatever we call it, the Ohio State teacher. And that's not coming up on those conversations. You know? So separating that, I think, is an important part of this.
One last question before we go to audience questions. What's next for each of you? Orrin, I'll start with you with this project.
So, I mean, one of the things that is getting the word out, right? Helping people understand that there is an opportunity to take in student perceptions and voice about what's going on in their classrooms and shape it in ways that can have an impact on them doing well in those classrooms. So getting the word out is absolutely what's next. And Camille mentioned, you know, that so Cultivate is taken in the fall, right after things are settled for schools, and then in the spring to give a sense of how well you've managed over that particular time. And as an assessment, if you will, there's a lot of time in between, right? And so, you know, we're working with Camille and Perts to try and figure out how do we do more sort of micro dipsticks along the way. So those are some of the things that next.
Cool. James, what about you? Cassie?
I think two answers. One is that we've been able to use this tool a number of times. And so looking at it from year to year, the more you use this tool, the more information over time we can see on what strategic shifts have we made with intentionality, and does that show up on the data? And so just being able to evaluate that and continuing that process year after year. But second of all, I love the last component of the interactive results that we were able to see, that there are practical suggestions to make a big difference. You know, and if we look at this data as a leadership team or as a staff even, we can't go crazy and implement 20 new things, you know. So what's going to get the biggest bang for your buck for your work that you're doing? And so really taking those suggestions and making them individualized to our school and to our student environment, and hopefully seeing the difference. Yeah.
You sort of mentioned this when you asked about the Chicago teacher strike, but as a teacher, and you guys probably know this, but the work is really challenging. there's a lot of time and intentionality that goes into planning every lesson, to getting the student work back. What feedback am I going to give them? And the Cultivate tool can help prioritize what is most important. And so that's something that I am continuing to pick apart. What is most important in the classroom culture that I'm setting up with my 7th grade math students, and how can I place value on the things that are going to get the biggest bang for their buck?
Audience questions. Yeah, I'm just wondering, beyond supporting individual teachers whose scores you can see, like, what is the teaming culture? Cassie, you spoke about what's the growth look like in your school for adults. Like, what are some examples of what you all are doing to build like a teacher culture of teams that can look at this and say, to the point of the presentation, it's not about the students, it's about the environment we're creating?
Well, I think one component from a leadership standpoint is how we set our goals and how we analyze those goals. And so we do this process at the beginning of the summer for the following year. And then we review it halfway through the year formally, and then again at the end of the year. And then there's in-between points in our leadership team where we're collecting those data points that we're going to be using for that mid-review and the end of the year review. And so how do we use this tool to look at those individual goals? We're talking like 1 or 2 school-wide goals. But using that data not as a honing down to classroom level, but as school-wide level, making tweaks in our plan or in our goals or in our professional development plans with our teachers to support them in this process. Because again, nobody wants 1 more thing to do or 2 more things to check off.
And we do something called inquiry cycles with our teachers that are focused in our school goals. And so as James mentioned, we set the work plan at the beginning of the summer, and then within, we have trimesters at our school. Each trimester focuses on a different goal. And teachers have the autonomy to choose what their interest is within that goal, and then they are doing research in their own classrooms and putting a new practice into place. And then coming back every Wednesday, and we report out what changes we're seeing in our classroom. Is our data shifting? Right now, I'm specifically focusing on how can I get students to start on the work? Like, how quickly can we get started on the work? How can I support them in just feeling confident to get started on the work? So I'm collecting data and just simply timing, and 3 minutes into class, I'm counting how many students have started work. And then I'm making changes to my practice and how I interact with students based on that. So that's all based in the work plan, which we pull from the Cultivate survey, from teacher surveys, and that kind of thing.
So it's kind of a combination question. So reference like on the 5 essentials, they actually have developed strategies that schools can implement. So you're talking about like how do we implement strategies over years? How are we documenting what's working, what's having that positive impact, that's increasing that growth mindset? Is that like a future portion of the tool, or and then at the school level, how are we documenting kind of creating this sharing process?
So, one of the things that I think I'll say is that it's important to remember that the results of this survey is based on student perceptions, right? So at the beginning of a school year, you have students. At the beginning of the next school year, you have different students. And so those perceptions for that particular classroom are going to change year over year. And theoretically, the teacher who is learning about the ways in which she or he is engaging with students in that classroom, they will see some growth as well, right? So one of the things that we work with our partners in building this site is to say that, we don't do trend analysis year over year because it doesn't necessarily make sense, right? The trend that should make sense is, are you seeing students in your school getting more A's and fewer F's, right? Because at the end of the day, that should be what we care about. That should be the measure of success. And along the way, there are these small things that we can do to sort of check in. Do kids feel like they belong? Or are they saying that this new science curriculum is relevant to them in their future? Obviously, that's going to change based on who answers it, but you can begin to try and roll that up slightly.
I think that from my most recent reflections and experience, this information helps us dig deep, right? And so as a school leader, I need to be mindful that that's at one level, and then we have a bunch of teachers down here. So we can't overwhelm them with this level of depth. We just realized this last Wednesday, like we need to go back to learning targets, how to rate good learning targets, because some of our new teachers didn't get the 3-day PD 3 years ago, and and so we kind of took a step back for a second, just specifically talking about learning targets. So when we talk about, okay, so how does the student sense of belonging work in your classroom? Whoa, like first, like let's back up a few steps of how are you organized to prepare for your students to enter into your classroom, maybe like first and foremost. So being able to differentiate that information, I think, and then documenting over time, I think, I can't say I have a formal process of it, but I can look at the data from each survey and what makes sense. You know, these are things we worked on and these are things that we need to improve on. And the next year, we can say that certain things were improved upon because of what we learned and started to implement. And so there's a little ebb and flow of where are we going with this, but it's a helpful tool to kind of help direct that so it's not too far off left and right.
Mostly for Cassie, as a teacher, and having been a teacher, I know it's really easy to get sucked into considering my students' performance and not using blame, but using a lot like the rain as reasons for my students' performance, right? And it wasn't until a mindset shift happened in me where it was like, well, actually, I'm in control of a lot of the environment that I'm setting up that can increase this performance. And especially for new teachers, can you talk about, has there been a shift in mindsets to flip that orientation from this is due to a child or a family relationship that I have, or a bad relationship with an administrator, or my colleague next door, or the snow outside, or like, can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yes. There has absolutely been a shift, and in myself, I see it too in my time at GEMS, but it's not perfect by any means. There are still those moments where it's like, oh, I can't teach today because there's this student that's causing chaos in class in this moment, and so I didn't get through my lesson, or whatever is happening. And so it's constantly a work in progress. I think teaching is just always a growth progress, and checking like, oh, I need to reframe how I'm thinking about that and how I can meet my students' needs. And within our staff culture, the people who have been there longer, I feel like really are probably better at keeping that mindset more often. And then as new staff spends more time in our school and with the data and just the culture that we've built at our school, I think we start seeing that shift in more and more people.
So a follow-up question. Do you see a shift in mindsets of students and helping engender the types of environment itself? I mean, this probably matters more for like, I feel like adolescent, like high school students. Like we see in the presentation that it's like, oh right, I remember this, like what do my friends think? That's what's bringing me to school. That's the connection that I'm feeling. Those are the things I'm worrying about. Do you see a shift in the students' ability to support one another in inhabiting these kind of mindsets?
I do, and there's still work to be done, but I do see a shift especially if I can set up the classroom where they're giving each other feedback, and we're working on accountable talk where they're using each other's names and they are talking in a kind way with feedback. And there are still moments where students are not kind. But then it's important to address that and reframe. How can we say that differently? And it's just this constant back and forth process to hopefully by the time that they're done being in my classroom in 7th grade, that there's been some shift in the way that they approach that.
7th grade.
Yeah, good old 7th grade.
Just one more question. So I'm curious and sort of a follow-up into the next steps. Have you all started to think, or is there anything in the works that might actually put a system like this in place for larger school districts that are having to address these same barriers, not from students, but from staff that are needing to have a shift in the culture that comes from the top?
Wow. Sort of, but nothing that is any mean shape to, I think, say much at this point. I mean, I think for those kind of entities, even exposure to using Cultivate over a year or two will likely begin to shift and change mindsets in places that begin to, focus them on the fact that, an adult in a classroom has a lot of control over what goes on in that classroom. Boom, take that and work with it. So, there are other things that I think that we can do to try and support those adults organizationally, and we have the 5 essentials. That's a tool that is in large part designed to say, like, how is this organization shaped and operating in ways that allows it to do the things that it's supposed to do. And so there's some room there to begin to work on some of those things as well.
Please join me in thanking our panel.